I think that does a service to the victims themselves, but also to future generations.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and for you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
So hi, I'm Brad Nichols, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Missouri. I specialize in the study of the Third Reich, Second World War, and the Holocaust, as well as genocide as an historical phenomena more broadly. I teach classes on all of these topics here at the University of Missouri. I want to thank you guys starting out just for contacting me to participate in this conversation.
My name's Leah. I'm the Resident Service Director at Vitalia Rockside in Seven Hills, Ohio, and we're here to talk about Holocaust Remembrance Day. First question is, what is the Holocaust?
So there are two definitions one could give here. The traditional one is that the Holocaust designates specifically what the Nazis referred to as the final solution to the Jewish question, the mass murder genocide of between 5.5 and 6 million Jews between 1939 and 1945. Second definition, though, and one that's more common now, is to expand outward to include not just Jews, but other victims of Nazi persecution and violence. This would include the Romani people, who used to be referred to as gypsies, although that's kind of a pejorative term. We don't really like to use that anymore. Up to 500,000 of whom were also murdered by the Nazi regime. This could also include victims of the Nazi euthanasia program, that is mentally and physically disabled persons in Germany and elsewhere, and other categories of people who were arrested and sent to concentration camps, homosexuals, for instance, Jehovah's Witnesses. Smaller numbers here, maybe a couple 100,000. What also another sort of set of groups that might be included under the rubric of the Holocaust are peoples of Eastern Europe who perished under Nazi occupation, specifically Poles. As many as 2 to 2.5 million Christian Poles would die under German rule during World War II. And anywhere between 10 and 13 million people if we include the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. So Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Latvians, the Baltic peoples, Russians proper. So there's one definition that is just Jews. And there's a second broader definition of the Holocaust that includes the persecution and mass murder of these other population groups. And obviously, if you include the latter into the mix, then the tally, the death toll, gets substantially larger.
So you mentioned other groups were targeted. Which other groups were targeted?
So in addition to the ones I meant, as I said, namely Romani, quote unquote, gypsies, mentally and physically handicapped persons who were considered to be genetically defective, homosexuals, political opponents, whom I didn't mention before, just basically anti-Nazis, regardless of their political orientation, who spoke out against the National Socialist regime. And then the various peoples of East, who could have come from anywhere in Europe, mind you, not just Germans. And then the various peoples of Eastern Europe who suffered enormously under German occupation during the war, particularly in places like Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltics. The difference here, the difference between sort of the two definitions, the two categories, is that what makes the final solution unique is its systematic character. That is to say, the Nazis attempt to exterminate all Jews, men, women, and children, regardless of where they were, anywhere within the German sphere of influence. Whereas these other victim groups were not targeted quite as comprehensively. I mean, not as comprehensively. They're not, with the Romani is the only group where sort of the policy comes close to this. They try to wipe out all of them. But in these other cases, it's not the same thing as the final solution, where they're systematically combing Europe to wipe out every last Jew they can get their hands on. You don't see the same thing with other population groups. They weren't considered to be as much of a threat by the Nazis, even if they were considered to be inferior and dispensable, even if in many cases the number of deaths involved was higher. So there's this sort of mosaic, a variety of different victims, but Jews are the central target always.
Yeah. Okay. Did the German people know the Holocaust was happening while it was happening? If yes, how did they react? And if not, how come?
Yes. The vast majority of Germans, even if they didn't know the precise details of the extermination process, they were aware of what was being done in general. It was kind of an open secret. We know this in part based on various forms of evidence, but maybe the most indicative one is that German Jews, in most cases, were deported to the death camps in Poland, Auschwitz, for instance, in broad daylight, in full public view. Their possessions were auctioned off afterwards, so people knew they were not coming back. And this is discussed among the German people. They acknowledge it, they know it's going on, but they don't really speak out about it. There's certainly no nationwide concerted effort to protest the final solution. In most cases, Germans, to get to your second question, in most cases, they just respond with indifference. They simply did not care. German Jews made up less than 1% of the population. They had already been effectively ostracized from public life, from national life. And it was just, people didn't care. They were apathetic about this. They didn't really care about Eastern European Jews or Jews from other countries in Europe that much either. In other instances, certainly some people did have moral qualms and reservations about this, but they felt in almost all cases that criticizing the government, criticizing the Nazi regime, criticizing their leaders in a time of war was simply a bridge too far. That what was more important was Germany's victory in the war, supporting the war effort, supporting the government, which makes it very difficult to criticize said government for anything. And these are really kind of the main two dynamics, the main two responses. German people are fairly well aware, certainly by 1943, it's well known as an open secret. Most people respond with indifference. Others are even horrified by this, but are not willing to speak out because their main concern is the war effort. And they do not want to challenge or criticize Germany as a whole, whether it's government or the people, in a time of war.
Could you give a brief history of why the Holocaust happened?
Yeah, so there is a substantial literature on this topic. Like, it could fill an entire massive library debating not only why this happened, but how it happened specifically. If you put my feet to the fire, my short answer would be, for the the why is that by the time of the Second World War, European Jews had become this sort of symbol for everything anyone could possibly hate about the modern world. They were, whether that was democracy, communism, Jews were associated with communism, whether it was feminism, even something as seemingly apolitical as modern art. Jews are scapegoated for all the various ills of modern society in Europe, particularly, although not exclusively, on the political right. There's a lot of anti-Semitism on the political left as well in Europe, particularly the far left, the communists, who tend to associate Jews with capitalism, another thing, kind of boogeyman. In a strange and changing world, Jews become the kind of main scapegoat for anything that goes wrong. And there's a longer history to this. I mean, Jews had been scapegoated in Europe for centuries. If we're talking about traditional Christian anti-Jewish prejudices, they had been blamed for various catastrophes, the bubonic plague, for instance, back in the late Middle Ages, and subjected to violence and persecution because of this. By the time you get to the 20th century, it's specifically Jews being associated with various problems of the modern world. In Germany specifically, they're blamed for Germany's defeat in World War I. And for the Nazis, they come to not just symbolize everything wrong with the world, but they're perceived to be, Jews invariably are perceived to be members of the same race, quote unquote, and engaged in this kind of diabolical international conspiracy to dominate the world and destroy Germany. They're perceived by the Nazis to be an existential threat, with no evidence to that effect, of course, mind you. And so once you get to that point, once you get into the Second World War, once you've demeaned and degraded these people and just unleashed all of this hate and fear and paranoia about them, the perception becomes that they cannot be allowed to live, to stir up trouble on the German home front in occupied Europe. Again, they were seen as having been responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I. The Nazis were determined that this would not happen again. And so you get the solution of, we need to just wipe them out entirely. Now, they don't come to the solution right away. This is a gradual process of escalation. Initially, at the outbreak of World War II, after the Germans conquer Poland, the idea is that they're going to expel Jews, deport them somewhere into Siberia or the Arctic or somewhere else. This plan entails massive loss of life, but it's not the same thing as what we know to be the Holocaust, industrialized mass killing in gas chambers and so forth. After the Germans invade the Soviet Union, Russia, and their military advance stops, the Nazis become aware that they can't deport them, and so the solution becomes to kill them instead, entirely, altogether, to neutralize this perceived threat. So the short answer here is that the Holocaust happened because of this prejudiced and paranoid fantasy, delusion of a world, an international Jewish conspiracy bent on destroying Germany. And the decision the Nazis make is that total eradication, what we now call genocide, is the only way to prevent that eventuality from happening. Again, that's a very simplified answer to how and why the Holocaust happened. And there are any number of directions you could from which you could address this question.
Is the Holocaust a unique or unparalleled event in the world's history?
So this is a very controversial question right now, especially in Germany, where there's a lot of debate about not just whether the Holocaust can be compared to other genocides, but specifically whether it's rooted in the violence of colonialism as a world historical phenomenon. As a scholar who's trained in comparative genocide, I tend to come down and say, yes, it is comparable with other genocides and other instances of mass violence, with the caveat that every historical episode and event is unique in its own way. There are certain things that are peculiar or singular about the Holocaust, but I do not believe that it is a wholly unique and incomparable and unprecedented event. Unfortunately, if you look at the history of the world, particularly in the 20th century, although before then as well, it's littered with violence on this scale, if not quite to this systematic extent, as I said before, wiping out every man, woman, and child. One, I think maybe the closest parallel here is what happens in Rwanda in 1994, where the idea here too was we are going to wipe out all of these people perceived to be our enemies. But there are any number of other examples you could point to in the history of the modern world, even the pre-modern world, the genocide of Native Americans, for instance, that can be compared in certain respects, even if they don't match up exactly. So they're not the same thing, but they're similar in a lot of ways in terms of how the victim groups are dehumanized, in terms of, to some extent, the process by which they are killed, but especially in terms of the rhetoric and the perception of various groups as existential threats that have to be dealt with. So no, it's not wholly unique, but it obviously has its own particularities, the Holocaust, I mean.
Okay. There are some people today that are comparing like events that happened to the Holocaust similar to events happening in the current world. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm of two minds on this, depending on what the comparison is. We hear a lot of talk with people comparing, since the pandemic started, comparing mask mandates and vaccine mandates to the Holocaust, which is, to my mind, absolutely preposterous. Full stop. Preposterous and insulting to victims of the Holocaust who endured a level of persecution and suffering that went way beyond being forced to wear a mask in public or get a vaccine. So in those cases, I find it to be silly, quite frankly. On the other hand, again, speaking to rhetoric, we do hear a lot of rhetoric, whether it's in Europe or the United States, particularly on the far right, about certain conspiracy theories about a majority population, white population, being quote unquote replaced by non-white immigrants. Sometimes people say that the Jews are behind this, right? So there's a pretty close parallel. Sometimes they don't. In many cases, the accusation is that the left or liberals or Democrats are kind of the orchestrators of an attempt to replace white Americans or white Europeans in that context. And that's very dangerous rhetoric that is reminiscent of what the Nazis claimed Jews were doing. So one of the kind of key tropes in Nazi propaganda was that Jews were the architects of a plan to encourage racial mixing in Europe, what used to be called miscegenation and racial degeneration. Is pretty similar to statements you'll hear now about the ostensible threat posed by non-white immigrants, again, in the United States and in Europe. In Europe, it's more refugees from the Middle East. In the case of America, it's more immigrants from Latin America, although not exclusively. Muslims are included there as well. That is all very dangerous rhetoric when you start to talk about quote unquote replacement, because it suggests that these others are an existential threat, and that anyone who is helping them or assisting them is an existential threat as well. So in that case, I don't want to, I'm always historians in general are always very cautious about drawing overly close parallels with the past, because as I said, every time period is unique in its own way. But there are certainly disturbing similarities in the rhetoric, political rhetoric nowadays that should give us cause for concern.
Why do you think some people deny that the Holocaust happened?
This is a really good follow-up question from the last one, because in many cases, Holocaust deniers will say this just never happened. In other cases, they'll say, oh, well, it wasn't as bad as people say it was. And they like to present that perspective as just another opinion. When you scratch beneath the surface, though, you will always find among Holocaust deniers a political agenda, whether it's an anti-immigrant political agenda, whether it's an anti-Semitic political agenda, and the two often go together, not always, but often, to drive their position, usually a racist white supremacist position, that if the Holocaust didn't happen or wasn't as bad in terms of its murderousness, then maybe racism isn't actually that bad. Maybe white supremacy or talk of Aryan racial purity isn't so bad either. So it's always tied to some kind of political agenda. And that's really what drives forth these pretty ludicrous statements that fly in the face of literally mountains of evidence we have to the effect that, yes, this did actually happen. The Germans kept meticulous records of it. It's essentially impossible to have thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of testimony from Holocaust survivors who are all supposedly engaged in some kind of conspiracy to make this up, to fabricate, to perpetrate this hoax on the world. It's preposterous on the face of it, but when you scratch beneath the surface, you will always find a contemporary political agenda driving it.
How or where do we continue to see the impact and relevance of the Holocaust today?
I think in all the ways I just talked about, there's examples of this sort of references to the Holocaust. They're ubiquitous. I mean, they're everywhere because it's sort of the go-to reference point for anything you want to depict as being absolutely evil. It's our touchstone of evil in the modern world, right? The worst thing that could possibly happen. And so it's an easy and well-known device that can be manipulated, and I would say trivialized, minimized for stuff like anti-vaccination rhetoric. That's just one example. People, on the other hand, will make comparisons all the time to, the police act like the Gestapo, and that's a kind of more indirect reference to the Holocaust or to the Nazi regime. This always comes up when you're trying to paint something as being totally evil and beyond the pale. The easiest way to do that is to reference this monstrous regime and this horrendous event that most people know at least something about. And we see this all over the place. It's very problematic. On the other hand, there's good reason why the Holocaust is the touchstone of modern evil. And I think the fact that we see its presence in movies, for instance, whatever creative license is taken, it's a good thing to the extent that people know that, yes, this happened and that, yes, it can happen again. So those are just some ways, kind of the good and the bad of how the Holocaust or Holocaust awareness is with us today in all sorts of various forms.
What would you say is the main purpose for International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and why is it celebrated on January 27th?
So it's celebrated on January 27th to commemorate the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army, by Soviet troops. It is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, obviously because it's for the whole world. There is a separate Remembrance Day in Israel specifically, which is also honored in the United States to some extent, known as Yom HaShoah, which is supposed to be for Jews specifically to reflect on the events of the Holocaust. That's in April. That commemorates the launch of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in Poland. The purpose of each event, though, is, I think, not just to reflect on these events, to remember that they happened, but I do think it serves a kind of preventive function. That is to say that something like this has happened since the Holocaust, despite the slogan of never again, despite the slogan of never forget, and that it can happen again, even here. And so I think the function of it, the purpose of it, is to honor the victims of the Holocaust, to honor their memory on its own, but also by trying to do whatever we can to ensure that nothing like that happens again to other people. And I think the two are related here. Commemoration of past victims on the one hand, and the protection, shall we say, of potential victims in the future. It doesn't mean we're going to be able to do that. As I mentioned, Rwanda is just one example. Bosnia is another one. There have been instances of genocide since the Holocaust, but we have to try. And I think that's the main purpose here. We have to try because we know it's the right thing to do, even if it's going to happen somewhere. We have to do something to at least recognize that this is evil and that it should not happen, because otherwise, what's the point?
Great. That follows up. The last question is, how can I honor those who died in the Holocaust as well as those who survived?
I think simply by pushing back against attempts to deny it, which again, they not only do a huge disservice, insult to the memory of these millions of people who suffered really for no reason, but it also, I think Holocaust denial, what makes it more dangerous is, again, in that it potentially allows for something like this to happen again. So pushing back against that kind of rhetoric, pushing back against prejudices against Jews and all peoples, really. Again, I think honoring the victims, honoring the memory of the victims of the Holocaust and survivors as well, in any way you can, whether it's, talking about it in your own private life, or even internally in your own way, remembering that this is a horrible thing that happened 70, 80 years ago now. I think that does a service to the victims themselves, but also to future generations who will hopefully not only remember this and carry on the same message, but can stand up against something like it recurring, wherever that may happen to be.
What started your interest in wanting to learn and teach about the Holocaust?
So I think it was learning about the story of John Demjanjuk, this Ukrainian collaborator with the Nazis who was a guard at several different death camps in Poland, and the whole kind of media circus around his arrest in Cleveland, where I grew up, his deportation, and all of the subsequent legal proceedings that followed in the wake of that. I think that's something that narrowed my interest in this topic specifically. More generally, as far as being an historian, my dad was a high school history teacher, So I was always sort of raised on bedtime stories about, Napoleon, and not the Holocaust. I was not raised on bedtime stories about that. But to some extent, I think the story of John Demjanjuk maybe warped my mind a little bit and got me interested in the darker side of human history. Whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's another genocidal episode, mass violence writ large is sort of my general area of expertise within the Department of History here at Mizzou, whether that's war, whether that's genocide. The two often go together, although they're not the same thing, obviously. That's really what's spurred my interest, as well as a trip I took to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC shortly after it opened in the 1990s. And I used to work there for a time, obviously much later in life. And it was strange to me going back there, my first day of work in the archives upstairs, and remembering when I had been there as, oh God, I don't even know, a 10-year-old boy, maybe too early to be learning about this sort of thing. But that's the answer to your question.
I was going to ask if you've been to the museum in DC.
Yeah, so I worked there for a year, mainly doing research. I had done research sort of there on and off in the years before this is all when I was a graduate student. And I've been through the exhibit itself several times. Once when I was a kid, I took my partner through it when I worked there. And I think I went through it one more time again. Absolutely fantastic vehicle for promoting Holocaust awareness and fulfilling all the objectives that I mentioned before about why never again, why never forget.
Yeah. I've been there twice. We went for my 8th grade DC trip. We learned about it that year. Then that was like one of the museums we were like required to go to. Then I was just there a couple years ago. And so
very powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very well done.
Are there any publications or shows you would recommend?
If there are lots of publications I could recommend. In terms of TV shows, there are a lot of good documentaries out there on Netflix and other platforms. There's one in particular by the BBC that I believe is called the Auschwitz, the Nazis and the Final Solution. Very informative. But not, kind of overly academic or highbrow. In terms of movies, I'll still say this, it's the we have like a whole genre of Holocaust movies now. But the kind of granddaddy of them all, and I think still the best one, is Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List. Not only because it's just a phenomenal film in terms of how it's put together on every level, cinematography, acting, and what have you, because I feel like for a mainstream audience, it touches on kind of all the various points that collectively explain what the Holocaust was, why it happened, how it happened. I still feel like, and I tell my students this, that if you could only watch one movie about the Holocaust, it should be Schindler's List. And this actually ties to the question about how I got interested in this topic. Back in the early, I think in 1993, I don't remember the precise year, NBC aired Schindler's List in prime time, unedited, with a little, kind of talk before it by Steven Spielberg explaining essentially, viewer discretion advised. This is incredibly disturbing material, but important material. And I remember, again, I was young. Maybe my parents shouldn't have let me watch it. Again, maybe they warped my mind, but being just blown away by it, and inspired to learn more about it. So that would be my main recommendation as far as media is concerned.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nichols, for coming here today and talking about this topic. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. No, and thank you guys again for reaching out. I hope this was educational and informative. And please feel free to contact me again if you'd like to do something similar down the road.
And I think to myself,